Welcome back to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of classic English literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and today we're presenting part 1 of 2 in our adaptation of the second ghost story of the week from the Victorian master Charles Dickens. This story is called The Trial for Murder, and it follows the strange experiences of an unnamed narrator and juror as he participates in a high-profile murder trial under mysterious and supernatural circumstances. I have always noticed a lack of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to telling stories of their own psychological experiences when they have seen something of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that they might be suspected as liars or laughed at. A truthful traveler who has actually seen some extraordinary magical creature, a sea serpent, for example, would have no fear of telling his story. But if the same traveler had had a bizarre experience more similar to impulse, vagary of thought, a vision, a dream, or some other unusual mental state, he might hesitate before telling others about it. We do not like to communicate our experiences of subjective things so much as we do our experiences of objective creation. In what I am going to tell, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever, but merely to state the facts as I experienced them. The story occurred several years ago, when a certain murder was committed in England that attracted a great deal of public attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in their atrocious spotlight, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body is now buried in Newgate Jail. I will purposely refrain from giving any direct clues as to the criminal's true identity. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him could have been known to me at that time. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper, which contained an account of the first discovery of the murdered body, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention, twice, maybe 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, a rush, a flow. I do not know what to call it. No word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room, like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of deep relief, observed the absence of a dead body on my own bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this odd sensation, but in my rooms in Piccadilly Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment it happened, and the sensation was accompanied by a peculiar shiver, which seemed to jolt the chair from its position. I got up and went to one of the windows to refresh my eyes and looked down on Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was strong. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a bunch of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell down and the leaves dispersed, I saw 2 men on the opposite side of the street, walking from west to east. They were one behind the other. The first man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the oddness and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a place attracted my attention. And next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. No person that I could see noticed them, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my windows, they both stared up at me. I saw their 2 faces very clearly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who had gone first had an unusual sort of glare, and that the face of the man who followed him was the color of impure wax. The details of the murder, gradually unraveling in the newspapers, soon became the talk of the town. I distanced myself from the gossip by deliberately knowing as little about the case as possible, but I knew that the suspected murderer had been committed to Newgate for trial. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some direction to my servant before he went to bed. My face was toward the only available door to the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was to the door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open, and a man looked in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. The man was the same man who had walked behind the first down Piccadilly, and whose face was the color of wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door. I rushed over and opened the dressing room door and looked in. I had a lit candle already in my hand. I felt no expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing room, and I did not. Aware that my servant was watching me with amazement, I turned round to him. "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw..." And there I laid my hand upon the man's chest, and with a sudden jerk he trembled violently.
"Oh, Lord! Yes, sir! A dead man beckoning!"
Now, I do not believe that this John Derrick, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen such a figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling when I touched him that I fully believe he gained his impression in some occult way from my touch at that instant. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen the face of the man who beckoned from the doorway before, except on that one occasion, walking down Piccadilly. I came to the conclusion that the first time I had seen him, he had desired to fasten himself upon my memory, and that the second time, he had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, although I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. I was awakened by John Derrick coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. It was a summons to serve as a jury at a sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never been summoned for jury duty before, and my servant knew well. For a day or two, I was undecided whether or not to respond to this call or ignore it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attraction, one way or the other. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I've made here. Ultimately, I decided that I would go. The appointed day was a raw morning in the month of November. I did not know that the murderer was to be tried at that session on that day. I took my seat in the place given to jurors and looked around the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapor hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows and the hum of the people gathered there. Soon afterwards, the judges entered and took their seats. A moment later, the murderer was brought in. The instant he appeared, I recognized him as the first of the two men I had seen walking down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt I could have answered. But I was called sixth or eighth, and by that time I was able to say, "Here. Now, listen." As I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking around attentively, became violently agitated and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so clear that it led to a pause, during which the attorney whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first terrified words to him were,
"At all hazards, challenge that man."
Why might the accused man utter these strange and horrified words at the sight of our unnamed juror and narrator? What might be the meaning of the various apparitions and sensations that have appeared before our narrator, and where will this story lead? Find out in part 2 of the Trial for Murder here on BeFM Drama, the conclusion of this week's ghostly double feature of stories by Charles Dickens.